Most states don't have any clear centralized database of what local elections are even happening.
There are roughly 2,400 elections for prosecutor and sheriff in 2026.
Being a prosecutor especially is often a stepping stone to being governor, attorney general.
In a lot of cases, this is a very powerful office, and sometimes with more oversight, sometimes with not.
There are a lot of cases that have egregious cases of misconduct that aren't really being paid attention to.
Welcome to the Decision Desk HQ podcast. I'm your host, Geoffrey Skelley, the Chief Elections Analyst here at DDHQ. It's easy to focus on the higher profile elections happening in 2026. Obviously, we do all the time. Control the Senate and the House will be on the ballot this November, as well as the governorships in 36 states. There will also be a ton of down-ballot races, including contests for many state executive positions and state legislative seats. And, Decision Desk prides itself on covering results for every election, no matter how big or how small. And this year, speaking of maybe elections that are a little bit more under the radar, a lot of voters will be making decisions about important local or regional offices, two of which are prosecutor and sheriff. They're elected positions in many states that play a key role in implementing various criminal justice policies. There are roughly 2,400 elections for prosecutor and sheriff in 2026, which means a large share of the nation's 3,100 plus counties and county equivalents will vote on at least one of these offices. Given the role that local law enforcement and prosecutors play in the criminal justice system and with immigration policy, these races are no small matter. And so to explore this maybe undercovered collection of elections, I am joined by Daniel Nichanian, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of the online publication Bolts. Daniel and the Bolts team report on local elections and institutions that affect American politics, with a particular focus on criminal justice, policing, voting rights, and democracy. And Daniel recently put together a great guide covering which states have prosecutor and sheriff elections on the ballot this year, and an overview of some of the biggest races and the issues that are at play. So with that, Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you. I've known of your work on a lot of different fronts for many years. I feel like I recall sometime at a political convention or something, we were a spreadsheet of yours with like delegate counts. Maybe it was the 2016 Republican nomination.
That sounds great.
Yeah. So I know you've been covering politics and things going on related to it for a very long time. So, but obviously for Bolts, you guys have this focus more on sort of local, regional elections and institutions. And just to get into this, I thought we would start with sort of what there are 37 states that are voting on prosecutor or sheriff or having elections, at least in some part of their state. Many of them, all the counties are voting on them, or most of them. A handful, it's just a couple. But nonetheless, and obviously every state has sort of different systems for this. Some or multiple counties might elect like a state's attorney together. Others, just represent a county. Some have judicial districts. So obviously it's a hodgepodge. And maybe that is a good way of getting into, why are these elections important? Why do you guys obviously focus on these as a big part of what Bolts is doing?
Well, it's great to join you, first of all, and talk about all this. And I appreciate the way you introduced it. And because I think a lot of people who are going to hear this are probably very used to following congressional races, governor races, and are the kind of person like I am, or probably you are, where as soon as a cycle starts, the day after election day in November, every Senate race and governor race happening the next cycle, a couple of years down the line, and everyone knows what seats lean Republican, what seats lean Democratic, and which is all important to the balance of power, to who has power, what is being done with it. When you look, the more you look down at the state level, the local level, the less the resources to even think that through are not there. The very question of who even is having an election in what place is missing. And when it comes to prosecutor and sheriff races, which is what we're talking about, but also what my guide is about and what we do a lot of at Bolts. Those are really, really critical, crucial institutions when it comes to anything about the criminal legal system, policing, also immigration enforcement, which we'll get to and is on a lot of people's minds right now. These are elected officials in most states, in most places, not everywhere, that therefore sort of are kings and queens in their fiefdoms. They have a lot of ability to set policy without real oversight, without being under the governor, without being under the county commission. It's really the prosecutor or the sheriff that is setting these policies in one way or the other on how to collaborate with ICE, on how severe, on how to approach bail, on what cases to seek the most extreme sentences, the death penalty, life sentences, and I could go on. We could talk about it, but that's where we need to have a sense of what those counties are, what those elections are, what states are having it, to even have an understanding of what the conversations are, what the scale of reforms, counter reforms on the table are. Because I think, what we've seen in the past few years is people tend to focus on a couple of places. LA, the Bay Area, New York get a lot of attention when it comes to these under radar races. And there's actually a ton of interesting candidates, ton of interesting debates happening from Minneapolis to Texas to the suburbs of Virginia, so a lot of places. So that's sort of what we care about here.
Yeah, and I am reminded you've said that they're almost like kings, or basically a sheriff in particular, I think, is sort of known as it's a very powerful office in many cases. And I was reminded when you said that of Harry Lee, who used to be the sheriff in Jefferson Parish outside of New Orleans. And he, I think, famously himself said, basically, this is from like 2006, being the sheriff of Jefferson Parish is the closest thing there is to being a king in the U.S. I have no unions. I have no civil service. I hire and fire at will. I don't have to go to council and propose a budget. I approve the budget. I am the head of the law enforcement district, and the law enforcement district has only one vote, which is me. This is like a quote for him. I mean, so it speaks to, like, in a lot of cases, this is a very powerful office. And sometimes with more oversight, sometimes with not.
I mean, it's interesting. That quote is interesting because in most places there should be some oversight. The county commission controls the budget. There's often a state agency that's supposed to regulate what's happening in jails, which is up to sheriffs. But in many cases, that's just not. There just really isn't oversight that really holds these people to account. We see that a lot with jail spaces and who actually is holding sheriffs to account for what's happening in jails. We see it a lot with prosecutors. There are a lot of cases that have egregious situations, egregious cases of misconduct that aren't really being paid attention to. Obviously, it's the role of the media, the press, to do that. But to the extent that the state institutions and county institutions often fail at that, that really leaves these prosecutors and sheriffs as tremendously important. Another thing that actually would be interesting to a lot of people who are more maybe used to think of other elections is being a prosecutor, especially, is often a stepping stone to being governor, to being attorney general, potentially other roles in Congress. Also sheriff. I have more examples of the prosecutor pipeline in mind. And that also, therefore requires paying attention to this, especially as over the past 8-10 years, there's been a lot more sort of systematic debate within, especially DA elections, to a lesser extent sheriff elections, between people who really have different visions of how to approach this. So it's not just a question of, personality. There's really different philosophies of how to approach the criminal legal system that are at play in some of these races.
Right. I mean, I can immediately, to your point about sort of it being a pipeline position, I mean, I can just right now, without any thinking, it was like Amy Klobuchar was the district attorney, or the county attorney for Hennepin County, Minneapolis, yes, before she got elected to the U.S. Senate. And then Wesley Bell from St. Louis area, now in Congress from the 1st District in Missouri. Just without me even like having to spend any mental energy. I just thought it too right there. So yes,
yeah. And interesting, and you named an interesting one because where Wesley Bell won a prosecutor race in St. Louis County a few years after the killing of Michael Brown in St. Louis County,
Ferguson,
and that was a Democratic primary where Wesley Bell ousted the incumbent, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, and from a reform campaign perspective, and came into office. And then a few years later, he ran against the left-wing incumbent in the U.S. House. So the roles were sort of changing in terms of who the more progressive person was, which isn't surprising because someone who's progressive in a prosecutor race might not be the most progressive option outside of the confines of the prosecutor race. So yeah, always very interesting to follow.
And so just something I think it's also worth talking about for a minute, and you mentioned it a little bit, is sort of the difficulty finding information about this. Given the sort of, our federal system, lots of different localities, different states have sort of different systems for even how they're set up. Is it a county attorney? Is it a district attorney? Is it, that and sheriffs sometimes oversee multiple jurisdictions that vote together. In other cases, just like the single county or the city. So there's just a lot of overlap and a lot of, I would assume, a high degree in variation in terms of what information is available to voters and media trying to cover this stuff.
I mean, even the most basic, there is no such thing as information that is too basic to be easily available when it comes to local county level elections. Most states have no centralized database. Some states are better than others, but most states don't have any clear centralized database of what local elections are even happening. Let's not even get into who's running for a second. But even every state, as you said, has often exceptions of when the county or might have a prosecutor or sheriff race. Within a county, it's not always the same. So one thing I did many years ago is sort of have an evergreen calendar of when every county has a prosecutor or sheriff race, which is very helpful because I don't have to reinvent the wheel every year. But if people are interested in that, it's available on Bolts. I'm sure you can find it through a search engine or something, but there's a kind of an evergreen calendar when every county has an election. But then that changes. For instance, California just recently changed its law to move every DA race and sheriff race in California from the midterm cycle to the presidential cycle. So they were last elected in 22. Anyone elected in 22 got 2 extra years in office and will be up next in 28. So that's something to change. And then I recently discovered, I went in a rabbit hole and discovered there were a couple of exemptions to that law.
Of course.
Santa Clara County has a DA and sheriff race this year, but almost every other county does not. So, just figuring that out is interesting. And often by the time it gets press coverage, it's the final weeks, the final moments, because by the time you get caught up. Then the other thing that can be difficult in many places is even figuring out who's running. You have to pull teeth to get a county to give you a full list of candidates. In some places like New York or Pennsylvania or states that come to mind where it's really pulling teeth up until the final weeks, the final weeks before a primary, you're still asking for a full list of candidates so you can follow up. So that's sort of this is not what's happening with a governor's race or a Senate race where we all know who's running as soon as the cycle starts. Yeah, well, very challenging, and we appreciate the work you do. So let's actually talk a little bit about that. In your recent preview, you basically laid out sort of what's happening, and then you did an overview where you sort of zoomed in a little bit on some important topics. And I think obviously in the moment we're in politically in the United States right now, there's probably no more hot button issue than ICE, and so in terms of the work you do covering local policing and criminal justice and the legal system,
local law enforcement has a role to play in interacting and cooperating with ICE. And so this has become, I think, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, a major issue and a point of contention in some of these races for prosecutor or sheriff. And so I thought maybe we'll start out with just talking about this thing called 287G, which I think Virginia just quit under the new governor, Abigail Spanberger, just quit cooperating with. But I'd love for you to explain why that is, and then sort of, I guess, the larger context of what's going on with these political debates and local law enforcement vis-a-vis ICE.
Yeah. So maybe to take a step back, ICE. Well, ICE really thrives with local law enforcement collaboration in terms of helping them identify people, helping them hold people that ICE is arresting. And that's been true for a very long time. And there's been, for a very long time, a lot of contestation around what the police department is doing and the sheriff is doing. What we saw during, especially the first time that Trump was in power, especially in the 2018 cycle, we saw sheriff races become places where these debates were happening. A lot of blue areas, a lot of blue areas, including in Minnesota and other places, had contracts with ICE. Often they had Republican sheriffs. Sheriffs were often Republican, even in very blue areas. But the topic of immigration and how these sheriffs were collaborating with ICE already became a hot topic in 2018. And a lot of sheriffs lost that cycle who were collaborating with ICE because of immigrant rights organizers who really put that issue on the table. We have continued seeing that since then. It didn't just stop when Trump left office, but now we're seeing that again. So what's especially important with sheriffs, more than prosecutors, that sheriffs control law enforcement. They control officers who can patrol the streets, who can stop cars on the highway. They also run the jails, and jails have been a space where a lot of people come in and out of jail who are not necessarily even charged with anything, who are certainly not convicted, but they might be brought in, booked, processed in some way. And there's in America, there's surprisingly huge numbers. It's very large number of people are coming in and out of the jail funnel, and that's a space sheriffs control. And if a sheriff wants to really help ICE and look for the status of people or ask questions, alert ICE, those are people who are already sort of constrained in jail. So that's a space that's gotten a lot of attention. And so the 287G agreement is one of the most high-profile ways in which sheriffs, in particular, but also other local and state agencies, but let's focus on sheriffs because it's the most frequent, can partner with ICE. So to make it kind of simple, what 287G empowers a sheriff's officer to act like a federal immigration agent. It gives them more authority to arrest people on immigration grounds, and just makes it a lot easier for ICE and a state agency or local agency, sheriff's department, to collaborate. Up until 2025, this program really only existed for the past 12, 13 years in jail, nowhere else. Trump has expanded it so that a sheriff's deputy can now, if they're empowered under this contract, do that sort of immigration work on the street when they stop a car and are doing regular patrol duties. So that's why it's become so controversial. So what was very interesting in 2025, where there were some sheriff races in certain states that had off-cycle elections, is we saw that come up. So in Bucks County in Pennsylvania, which is one of the most important swing counties for national politics as well. Just north of Philadelphia. Yes. Very 50-50 county. Very 50-50 county. In 2024, I don't have the exact percentage. I should have prepared for this podcast. It was a very, very tight, like within a percentage point. A Republican sheriff there was in power and had just joined the 287G program in Bucks County, and a Democratic challenger made that the main issue on which he ran, he promised that he would immediately quit the program. The Democrat won in November by, I think, 12 to 14 points. As every listener knows, Democrats had a great night in November all over the place. There were elections, including in Pennsylvania, and they flipped that. And the sheriff came in, and within a few days of taking office in January, ended the 287G contract. So all this to say, this is this is both a very interesting thing to pay attention to, how sheriffs are collaborating with ICE. And specifically, this 287G program isn't such an easy way to have a list of sheriffs in the program, get a sense of their politics, and also, and this is what you've shown on this map, get a sense of where this is happening in places where you would maybe not expect. And so the states in green on the map we put together are states that have a sheriff race in a place where the sheriff is part of this program, this ICE program. So it's a lot of states. And then the specific places that I focused on are places that voted against Trump in 24. So even Bucks County had voted for Trump. So these are places that are even bluer than that, and that have a 287G agreement. Not necessarily because we know they will be something happening, because you never know who runs for a sheriff race and what they're running on until the filing deadline passes. But that's where you would expect an immigrant rights, someone who's running on a platform of immigrant rights, to be able to make the most out of a campaign. To give one example, because I could talk about this for a while, but
there are a lot of these races, so you could probably have a lot of examples. Yeah,
I'll pick one in Frederick County, because the sheriff there,
Frederick County, Maryland.
Apologies.
Yeah.
Frederick County, Maryland, which is very close to Washington D.C. It's about an hour drive. To give you a sense of where it is, there's a sheriff there who's been in office for a very long time, a Republican sheriff, but beyond a Republican sheriff, or a sheriff who's been very conservative and for a very long time has partnered with ICE. This is definitely not a Trump era situation in terms of how this person has ended up in that role. And it's a county that voted against Trump in 24, that voted for Harris in 24. And the sheriff is up for re-election this year. And the general election is what would be important there, because it is a Republican who is in that position. And the filing deadline is still a while away. We actually at Bolts covered his sheriff race in 2022. There was someone who ran at the time and said they would end the 287G agreement. The sheriff won. The Republican sheriff won in 22, not by a lot, I think by 6 or 7 points. Also a different context, though. It was the Biden years. Not that collaborating with ICE necessarily is that different in terms of what you're doing. The scope might change, but the politics have changed, I think, of what voters are thinking about, whether voters are even going to the polls having immigration in mind, whether they've been alerted to the fact that the sheriff's race is relevant. So that's the kind of thing where it'd be interesting to see if 2026 is different than 2022. In that county and in the others on this list. I mean, there are some big ones, like especially Clark County in Nevada, which is Las Vegas, of course. So that's another interesting one that we'll be watching.
Yeah, with the Frederick County example, this is a place that has been trending Democratic in the Trump era, but you have a Republican who was elected before the Trump era, who's been there for a long time, and I think you were saying, the fact he got reelected in 2022. It's sort of like what was sort of the lens that people were looking at immigration through, and how are they viewing it, or how would they even have thought about the sheriff's race in that context, right? It's like in 2022 and in the 2024 presidential election, we saw concerns about immigration. I think particularly in the 2024 election, in a way that there was concern about enforcement, there was concern about the border, there was concern, and a lot of those things I think helped Donald Trump win the presidency in 2024. But in 2022, people may not have in Frederick County, Maryland, may not have been thinking about the sheriff's race in the context of immigration. Right. But here in 2026. Obviously, with the controversy surrounding ICE, it seems very likely that will be a major
Right. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think, first of all, most people don't necessarily think of a sheriff's race, and if they do, it's often if it's contested, if there's candidates, if it gets attention, it often is a contest of personalities. I mean, in many places when there's a sheriff race, it's a sheriff versus their first deputy or something like that, someone with the current law enforcement, and the policies. Even if they have policy differences, I mean, it does happen sometimes. You ask a sheriff candidate or a prosecutor candidate a policy question, and it's often happened to me where the response is, "What we are not a policy office. Like policy is not what I'm running on. It's not always, but there is a moment of these people want to get away with not taking positions on issues, even though there's very clear choices to be faced, whatever your views are, whatever you want to happen, what a sheriff does with regards to a 287G agreement, but also with regards to other things relating to immigration. You know, I'm keeping it somewhat simple here on one example of partnership. That's an actual choice that you have, whether you will seek the death penalty or not is something that a lot of prosecutors have taken a stance on. But you often get a refusal to answer, which I think is what's important, because in a moment like 2026 or 2018, it was not as easy to avoid the issue of what you would do, because there were a lot more people asking, a lot more attention to it, and I think 2026 will probably be more like 2018 in that sense.
That makes sense to me, especially in places where, you know, the sheriff or prosecutor might hold positions that maybe in a bluer, you know, in a place that's more democratic leaning, they might be at odds with. And so obviously we just talked about sheriff elections a little bit in the context of ICE. I wanted to broaden this out and maybe you've already, you know, mentioned why sheriff elections are important. But sort of looking at the overall picture of states that are holding sheriff elections, you know, it's like, I think it's 29 states have at least some sheriff elections in 2026, and in a lot of major communities, you know, big counties in terms of population or major cities. Again, it varies from state to state how these, you know, how the things are even structured.
Yeah, I mean, sheriffs have very different roles, place to place, especially compared to prosecutors. It's not quite as even. I mean, the two main roles that are interesting from probably the perspective of this conversation is, again, how they run the jail space, because that's really where a lot of people go through, often in very terrible conditions, including fatal conditions frequently. In many jails around the country, there's a crisis of people dying in the jail. People go in for a couple of days, and then there's frequently, again, around the country, death, and that's partly because of the conditions in the jail, partly because of but for instance, just to give an example around how a sheriff thinks of substance use, and when someone is coming in with a substance use problems and they may go into withdrawal into jail, is there attention to that, or are there medication ready to avoid fatal conditions? So there's sort of a question around what's happening in the jails, and then sheriffs in some but not all places have the role of being the law enforcement authority in a community, and anything you can think of having to do with police debates, like the police departments often get more attention around use of force, misconduct, all of those debates. In some places, the sheriff is what is who does the policing, who does the patrolling, and where we see those same questions of use of force and misconduct. So this map here is the map of every county above 500,000 residents with a sheriff race in 2026. So we sort of covered the ones that specifically have this ICE agreement that is an interesting window. I will say every sheriff department, whether or not they have that specific 287G agreement, the question of what exactly they're doing with ICE is the live question. There's a lot of different ways of when you get a call from ICE saying, we know you have this person who was just booked in your jail, can you hold them for us for a couple of extra days? A lot of sheriffs do that, some sheriffs refuse. Just so that's always going to be a question when it comes to immigration enforcement. The one thing that's sort of tragic and depressing is just one thing I was doing is trying to get a sense of recent death in jails in the places on this list, and places where jail has been covered as particularly controversial and particularly horrid conditions, where there's been sometimes a court case, a lawsuit filed about the conditions of someone's death. And so many of the counties you're seeing here have an active live suit that alleges really horrible conditions in the jail, from Chicago and Cook County to Minneapolis, which is Hennepin County, to a lot of other places. This is not really a blue versus red issue in terms of how poor the conditions are in these jails. So that's really something that you don't really necessarily see a lot of conversation within a race, but a race can be an opportunity to just make sure it gets a little more attention. It gets on people's radar that something's happening in their community, in their county, where that merits more attention.
Yeah, this reminds me of, obviously, we're talking about sheriffs and prosecutors. I feel like I have to bring up Joe Arpaio, who may be one of the most famous sheriffs in modern times, and I remember, one of the things that eventually led to his losing re-election in 2016 was sort of rising dissatisfaction and anger about the treatment of, I think it was like they had like 10 cities of a kind. It was very hot in Arizona, in Phoenix area. Maricopa County specifically is where he was the sheriff. And so just, that brings to mind this very famous individual, because he was so powerful and was so well known in Arizona and Maricopa County more specifically, where Phoenix is. And so just I thought that was that'd be a helpful example for people to understand the context of this. Yeah.
Well, and Joe Arpaio, is possibly best known for his views on immigration and for the ways in which he partnered with the federal government pretty aggressively at the time, and was hit by orders that he was racially profiling as a sheriff in arresting people or in arresting cars. So there was a lot around that. He's also a sheriff that oversaw particularly horrible jail conditions. A lot of people have died under Arpaio's watch in jails that he ran in conditions that involved being restrained in pretty gruesome ways. The county spent a lot of money, both in court and then paying families of loved ones. So Arpaio is someone where we really get the whole picture of why a sheriff matters. He lost his re-election bid in 2016. Is that what you? I think that's
it was Paul Penzone.
In 2016, that's not up this year, but it's not that different in many other places. I think Arpaio was such a larger than life figure. He looked like a sheriff. He always wore a hat. I mean, he was a huge county.
Central casting, he was out of central casting
for a sheriff, which obviously the Trump would love. We're not seeing it's not that different in many places. Just people who maybe are attract a little less attention to what's going on, and it's easy to look away from what's happening in the jail because you feel like you're not going to end up there, maybe, and that's not for you to worry about. But if you do worry about it or care about it, you should look at what's happening in the sheriff race where you are, and in the jail where you are, and so on.
Well, obviously we could talk about these things endlessly, but let's move over to the prosecutor.
Okay, can I add one? I'm going to add one thought on sheriffs.
Yeah, please do.
I was going to add on sheriffs. Another thing that people who watch this might be interested in is that one thing sheriffs control is whether individuals who are in the jail can vote, because jail spaces are not prisons. People in jail typically have typically not gone through a trial yet, have not been convicted of a crime, and have not lost the right to vote. But sometimes individuals are in jail for weeks or months and are there during elections. And often a lot of groups go to jails, try and get in jails, try and help people access mail ballots. try and access voting, and sheriffs in many places make it extremely difficult for people to get access to mail ballots, to get access to the opportunity to vote. That's something that should not be up to sheriffs, obviously, but that in practice often is. In a few places like Chicago, sheriffs have created polling places in the jail where actually people in jail can go vote in person. So that's maybe one side of what can be done. But that's an example of the kind of thing that sheriffs really control when they shouldn't, because everyone in jail typically has the right to vote because they haven't yet lost it.
Right. Obviously, innocent until proven guilty, et cetera. But then it's sort of in practice versus in theory, yes. Right? Yeah. Exactly. So no, that's another that's the kind of thing that I would not have thought about. I'm glad you mentioned that, especially given our focus on elections here and voting.
Interesting twist.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of shifting to the other thing that you really focused on here, you talked about sheriffs and then prosecutors, and we even mentioned earlier in the episode, this is in particular, I think oftentimes a stepping stone to other offices, higher profile offices, elected office, and people who are like a district attorney, a state's attorney, a Commonwealth's attorney. If you're from Virginia, that's where I grew up. So it was always the Commonwealth's attorney election. That these are important elections where people are electing the person who is going to essentially run prosecution locally, or the region, depending on the setup of the state. And there are a lot of those elections on the ballot. It looks like there are, I think, 27 states that have at least some elections for local or regional prosecutor or county prosecutor, again, however it's set up in that particular state. And so what I guess top line, why are these races critical?
Right. So where to start? There's a lot of dots on this. Maybe I'll
do that in a concise manner.
Right. I think over we mentioned earlier the St. Louis election, which was in 2018, where a reform candidate won. I mean, they around 2017, 2018 was the start of like a group of people called themselves a progressive DA movement, progressive prosecutors, that started running in these elections. Interestingly, in places like Philly, where Larry Krasner won, one of the most famous examples of this, it's people who were outside of the usual system of assistant DAs becoming DAs. Larry Krasner was a civil rights attorney, which made it particularly interesting. And we have since then seen, in some places, this is the kind of thing where like it's really uneven. In some states, it's constant. In some states, there's barely been really any example of this type of electoral competition. But we're seeing in some places a real conflict between people running on explicit reform messages that basically argue that there's that mass incarceration is a problem, that there's so much incarceration, and DAs do have a major responsibility that's a fact. DAs really control how you charge, how much you charge, and what sentences you ask for. And people who have a more traditional approach typically oppose reforms and fight reformers. And we've seen a push and pull. What's maybe complicated to track compared to how you would track a governor's race or a Senate race, right, is it's not really happening between parties. Not necessarily because there aren't Republicans who talk about criminal justice reform, more because counties typically are not competitive, right? Like if you think at the county level, most counties tend to be very red or very blue. So a lot of what we're talking about today at the sheriff or prosecutor level is going to be in places that are absolutely not competitive in the general election. I mean, I did talk about Bucks. The first place I mentioned probably was a bad example as a result, because that's 50-50. But in most places, that's really not what we're talking about. Philly, what I just mentioned, that was there's no question that Republican is not going to win in Philly. And in many places where this debate are happening, it tends to be a place where only a Democrat can win, tends to be a debate in the primary, but not always. So that it's not like the partisan label is going to tell you much of anything about what.
And in some cases, there's not a partisan label. In some of these elections, it's nonpartisan.
In any cases, there isn't a
partisan label. At least not on the ballot. There's no partisan label.
California has no, for instance, partisan label for sheriff or DA elections, and other states are like that too. So. Very, very important point. So, if that's sort of the contest, the disagreement you're interested in, obviously it's important to see what they're saying, what their backgrounds are, why they say they're running, and so on. And there's been, a lot of attention in recent years in California, in LA, and the Bay Area, both Alameda County and San Francisco. Progressive DAs lost in 2024 and 2022. They were ousted after a first term. So there's been sort of a major loss of progressive in California. In other places, there's sort of a California situation and the rest of the country situation, to simplify. In other places, that's not really what we're seeing. Just in 2025, Krasner won a third term in Philly, and in Virginia was very interesting because obviously we were following Virginia last year in the primaries and the general. A bunch of people who ran on reform incumbents won re-election, and so that there's been an interesting dynamic there. Actually, just a week ago, a number of people who are part of this conversation of reform DAs, progressive DAs, put out an announcement that they were going to form a coalition to start talking and figuring out how to charge federal agents, federal ICE agents in the context of violence and the violence we are seeing in Minneapolis and elsewhere. And Philly was in that. The Virginia suburbs that I'm mentioning were in that, and other some other DAs that anyone who's been trying to follow this immediately recognized as part of that effort. So. In 2026, there's a lot of elections, about 1,000 DA elections, county attorney elections, whatever they're called in your state, which you can see a lot of them on this map. And I think just to name one example of them, Minneapolis immediately comes to mind for a couple reasons. One, because Minneapolis right now is on everyone's mind. The county attorney there has actually been part of the push and pull between local and federal authorities because she's trying to investigate or think about charging the federal agents who killed Renee Good and Alex Pretty, but is encountering obstacles. She is one of the people who won in 2022 on a reform platform, a progressive platform from an outsider's perspective. She's one of the people that I'm talking about, and she's not going to run for re-election in 2026. And we already knew that. So already in 2026, the county there, Hennepin County, was one of the more interesting places to follow. And now with all of the conversations right now, what's happening there, it's even more, it's an even more interesting race to see if the county will double down on the progressive approach that Mary Moriarty had taken, or whether it will maybe opt for a more traditional or tougher on crime approach. So that's the first race that comes to mind as an important one this year.
Yeah, and I guess sort of speaking maybe to some of the so that's a place where it's kind of an open question. In terms of what course the place might take. Are there any maybe notable, more conservative or tough on crime prosecutors who might be on the back foot or a little bit up against it in places that a progressive challenger, maybe a dark blue place might find, might be able to defeat them or challenge them?
Yeah. So I think, a lot of places have a prosecutor. We're moved on. A prosecutor who has. So a lot of prosecutors are very prominent voices when it comes to bills that are being debated. So we know in many places that Democratic prosecutors are leading voices against reform when a bill is being proposed. So it's interesting.
This is a bill like state legislatures.
At the state level, prosecutors have a lot of influence, and prosecutors typically, whether they're Republican or Democrat, in many places represent the voices that are sort of anti-reform when it comes to sentencing reform, bail reform, and so on. We saw that in New York, really. There's no major de-election in New York. There are some small elections in New York, but so for instance, in Vegas, in Baltimore County this year are places that come to mind where incumbent prosecutors who have not just beaten a progressive challenger in the past in those cases, but also tend to be sort of people who speak up against criminal justice reforms at the state level are up this year. It'd be interesting to see whether they get a challenger that really is going to prioritize these issues. Maybe just to talk out one example in Vegas, in 2022, there was a very interesting election there because the incumbent there in Vegas is, by national standards, a prosecutor who seeks the death penalty very frequently. So the death, capital punishment there is particularly
Steve Wolfson, right?
Yes, Steve Wolfson. He's known for being someone who seeks death penalty frequently, and has sort of made Vegas somewhere that's by national standards a place that has more death sentences than you see elsewhere. And his opponent in 2022 ran on. He said during the campaign he would not seek a death sentence. So here's a case, that a specific policy issue and a specific promise by one that is very different than the other, and voters in that case re-elected the incumbent. But it's an interesting example of the kind of disagreement that can emerge in a prosecutor race, and I think it's still remains to be seen the extent to which there is an active campaign there around these issues this year. It's still in a while, but that's one we're watching. In a lot of places, we've seen similar conversations of someone saying, I will never do this, around abortion, around the issue of abortion, with some candidates saying, I would not prosecute an abortion case. Some others saying it'd be case by case, depends on state law. So that's another issue that we've seen some of these conversations around.
Well, it's a great reminder that these individuals have a lot of leeway, a lot of say over specific implementation of policies, how those policies are, how certain things are carried out, whether it's how to charge people with something, whether to charge people with something, to what extent to charge them with something, and what sort of sentencing they seek. And so obviously, I think we've established these are the sheriff and prosecutor are two very important offices that are perhaps under the radar for a lot of people. And so I guess actually with that, and I think we can start to wrap up here, but I thought something that was worth mentioning, and is something you've mentioned before, is that a lot of these races in various localities are unopposed. A lot of incumbents who've been there a while don't have any opposition. I mean, because people aren't really paying that much attention to these races, sometimes someone can hold one of these offices for a very long time.
I mean, that's really the first thing to watch when filing that line. I mean, that's obviously the case in any race, right? But when it comes to prosecutors and sheriff, the odds are you are sure something's going to be super interesting, and then no one is running for the office, and that immediately kills, obviously, kills coverage, kills debate, kills any possibility of even from the perspective of our conversation, just the race is over before it starts. So we certainly see the majority of DA races draw only one candidate. Often incumbent, but sometimes a non-incumbent just goes into office. And this is not, when I say the majority, there's a lot of very small counties in the country. That's not really what we're talking about. There's often very large counties that go uncontested very, very, very frequently. So maybe to talk about this in the context of that ICE map earlier, when I said these are counties where you would expect there to be the lowest hanging fruits for people, for Democrats in most cases, to run and change county policy. We thought that in 2025 there were a number of places in Virginia that were either competitive swing areas or voted Democratic, like Virginia Beach and Chesapeake, that Democrats had no candidate. Chesapeake was a county where a Republican sheriff that had just signed a contract with ICE and no Democratic candidate. I mean, given what happened in Virginia in November, you could imagine anyone just getting swept into office in Virginia if you have a D next to your name. But absent the question of the D versus the R, in many places, it's not because something you would think is important or interesting that you will have campaigns. So I already had done some stats. Obviously, some filing deadlines are over. In North Carolina, 28 DA races this year drew a single candidate out of 39, and Arkansas, 20 out of 28 drew a single candidate. So across these two states, that's 48. That's already for 48 officials who are sure to waltz into office in 2026. And from a perspective of trying to cover it, it makes it easier because by the time the filing deadline, the 1,000 races that are on the ballot become 200 races that even have candidates, and then you can sort of look within them what is interesting, who's saying what is winnable based on the partisanship. So the numbers dwindle very quickly of what even could be an interesting election from an electoral perspective. But that's always very striking. It happens also at the court level. In Nevada, two Supreme Court incumbents, and who are both conservative, are going to run without an opponent in 2026. We already know that. So as soon as you leave the land of congressional races and governor races, this is the reality of a lot of races just are over as soon as the filing deadline passes.
Which, of course, it's in terms of having debate over certain policy and positions and whatnot is maybe not ideal. It's maybe easier to cover when you're trying to make a spreadsheet, right. But it's not necessarily better for democracy and the debate of ideas, the contest of ideas.
It's not, and it's also not for the sake of I was talking earlier about sometimes an election is less about the fact that there's a clear disagreement than an opportunity, a window into an issue that is under the radar, like jail conditions, and in most places that window isn't even there. So whether it's literally that there isn't a debate, or whether the fact that these officials are important, have all these authority, have all this power, that's already under the radar, and then the one opportunity to sort of think about it as a political moment, an electoral debate is gone, and then you wait another 4, in some cases 8 years before another opportunity. So that's just something that really shapes any understanding of how to think about sheriffs and prosecutor from an electoral perspective.
Well, obviously not under the radar, not covered as much, in a lot of cases uncontested, some of these contests, but they are important. And I wanted to close with you maybe telling listeners and viewers a little bit about Bolts and what you guys are doing and the background on that on your publication.
Well, you maybe got a sense of the kind of things we do already. If you're watching this, Bolts launched in 2022, and we basically try and, I think our conversation was very helpful in explaining what we try to do, which is when it comes to criminal justice issues and voting rights policy, which is our second umbrella, a lot of the authority, a lot of the power is at the county level, at the state level, sometimes at the municipal level, certainly when it comes to the police, for instance. And that makes it very difficult to keep track of what's going on for people who are interested in it from a national perspective, or want to know, maybe even if you work on an issue in a particular place, you might not know what's going on in the state next door, or what interesting conversations are happening. So, one mission was to help lower the bar of understanding and engaging what's going on, and having a place where we can even have a map like this, a conversation like this that, I think we saw a week ago when the prosecutors released that statement about wanting to talk about how to prosecute ICE, that there is a connection between what's happening in Philly and what's happening in the suburbs of Virginia, what's happening in Minneapolis when it comes to some of the policies these people are thinking about and implementing. We also know at the state level, states imitate each other. So, trying to put the focus on state and local institutions and guide people through all the systems. We talk a lot about elections here, but not everything we do is about elections, certainly. But trying to understand how state institutions and county institutions are shaping these issues is sort of where we're at. So you can find us at boltsmag.org. Awesome.
Well, Daniel, it's been lovely having you on. Thank you so much for going over this. I think for an audience that is really into elections, this is like a reminder that there's a lot of other stuff on the ballot too, and a lot of that stuff is important. We're electing people to pursue certain policies and implement certain policies, and how they go about doing that is important in day-to-day life, actually, and has consequences. So thank you so much. This is Daniel Nichanian, who is the editor-in-chief and founder of Bolts Mag. And he, love, amazing conversation. Thank you so much for going into all this. You can find him again at boltsmag.org. They have coverage of all sorts of things related to this topic, not just elections, but though elections is our main thing, our main focus here. I'm Geoffrey Skelley. I'm the chief elections analyst at Decision Desk HQ, and I really appreciate people watching and listening and hearing all about prosecutor and sheriff elections. Just another thing that's happening in the 2026 midterms.
It was really fun conversation. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us.